Lancaster County wore its prosperity like a polished buckle. Broad fields, fat barns, and the clatter of wagons hauling wheat to feed a nation at war. Yet under the neat rows of corn and the clipped hedges of meeting houses, something mean and hungry moved. On a low rise outside Strasbourg, a 3-story brick orphanage lifted its Gothic windows toward the sky as if pleading. Sacred Heart, the Sisters of Mercy, called it. To the Protestants who passed by on Sundays, it looked like Rome had driven an iron stake into their soil. Mother Superior Catherine O'Malley kept the place standing by will alone. She was a Cork woman with a rosary bite worn into her thumb and a bookkeeper's eye for stray pennies. Twice a week she woke from sleep, certain she could hear the scrape of the coal scuttle and count each briquette by sound. 60 children ate there by 1862, thin-faced boys and girls in gray wool, their hair cropped, their hands careful around blessings and hot kettles. They worked gardens, mended hems, knelt in the chapel at dawn while the bells shivered the morning mist. Sister Agnes Flanagan, treasurer and confessor to every crooked column in the ledger, kept the accounts neat as stitches. The numbers told a truth pious speeches did not. Donations were a trickle, costs a river, and winter came on like a debt collector. Then Father Michael Brennan arrived with city polish on his boots and the kind of smile that invited both secrets and investments. He claimed the bishop had sent him to solve problems. He spoke Protestant as fluently as Latin, knew when to talk wheat yields and when to talk souls, and smelled the great vacancy that the war had scraped from the countryside. Young men gone to the regiments meant horses unshod and wheat uncut. He began to call the shrewdest farmers neighbors, and they returned the favor by meeting him at their side doors. The first boy left in June, a red-haired 14-year-old named Timothy Walsh, with a scar across his left palm from a kitchen knife. Brennan brought a prosperous wheatman to the garden and watched him weigh Timothy like a butcher weighing bone. The farmer peeled gold coins from a purse, $45, bright as hammered sunlight, and promised a bed in the loft and return by November. Sister Agnes, standing at the kitchen window, felt a splinter under the nail of her mind. Gold in wartime, when even the baker counted paper. She wrote Timothy's name carefully in her private notebook anyway. Freckles, quick smile, afraid of thunderstorms. The pattern grew like a mildew ring. A girl with languages in her throat, Margaret Connolly, went off with a German farmer's wife to mind the twins. More boys followed. More girls, each lifted out of the orphanage as neatly as spoons from a drawer. A merchant in Lancaster needed help. A banker's wife in Columbia couldn't cope without a maid. A mill owner wanted a lad for the horses. The sums rose as the wheat turned from green to gold. The orphanage debts shrank. New coats were bought. Extra oats came in. The brick walls seemed to warm by a degree. No letters came back. That was the strangeness that wouldn't be soothed. Children placed in earlier years had written clumsy notes about chickens and cold chimneys and God's kindness. Now nothing. When Sister Agnes took a market day to call at the Hoffman farm and ask after Timothy, Mrs. Hoffman blinked through her veil and claimed no such boy had ever labored there. Perhaps the sister had mistaken the place. Perhaps the heat had got to her. That night in the tiny office behind the chapel, Sister Agnes confronted Brennan. Candlelight sharpened his profile into coin edges. "Where are they?" she asked. "Placed," he said. "Useful, safe, and our Lord will be better served by a solvent house." She said the word that had been stalking her prayers. "Sold." He didn't flinch. "You've a choice, sister. You can trust those set over you, or you can tangle yourself, and the children who remain, in knots that will choke this house. The war asks certain sacrifices. Would you rather we closed our doors to the 60 for the sake of 8? Winter ground its teeth on the window panes while Sacred Heart lived in a new quiet. Children spoke more softly, as if loud words might draw a rope around their shoulders. They grew to fear birthdays. 14 was a doorway. 16 was a sentence. They began to sleep with their shoes under the bed, laces tucked into the cuffs of their nightshirts, and they dreamed of wagons. Sister Agnes stopped sleeping. She built a second ledger in a little hand that never wobbled, writing what the official books refused to speak. Names, ages, accents, scars, who they had loved in the dormitory, and what hymns they sang too fast. The exact date a wagon gate creaked shut, the color of a ribbon left behind. She wrote as if memory itself might be a raft. In March of '63, a bishop came up the lane without notice. Francis Patrick Kenrick, cold-eyed and precise. He walked the halls with 2 fingers on the rail, listening to the wood. Brennan paraded improvements, numbers, new blankets folded square. When the bishop asked to see the placement papers, the priest promised them tomorrow, and tomorrow became a wall he could not climb. That night, Brennan packed the gold and the names and slipped into the dark with a letter about answering God's call as a chaplain. Morning found his pillow cool. The bishop sat with Sister Agnes in the orphanage library while a single lamp burned low and the saints in the colored windows watched without blinking. She slid her private notebook across the table. The bishop turned the pages like a man paging through bones. "This will break the house," he said at last. "It will break many things. It will save the next child," she said. "The one's already gone. That is, for God." What the bishop's men found first came on Mennonite lips. A young farmer with grief in his posture who said a family called Yoder had taken 2 Irish children and kept them like tools. The constables went. They came back with a boy called Sean and his sister Ellen, pale as moths, knuckles scarred, eyes trained not to meet anyone's gaze. They slept on straw, the children said. They had been told Sacred Heart burned and all the sisters died. That soldiers would take Irish Catholics and shoot them. That silence was salvation. The truth came out in scraps, in pauses, in the way Ellen counted her breaths before speaking. Other farms opened like rotten barrels. A Chester County man had buried 3 children behind his barn, their graves the size of winter seedlings. He wept when faced with the coroner's report, then admitted what a shame could no longer hide. He had bought them, worked them, watched them fail, and feared a doctor's questions more than a child's fever. By autumn, they found Brennan in an army camp near Gettysburg, wearing another name and an unconvincing beard. He tried on innocence like a vestment, then dropped it when the ledgers were laid down in front of him. The confession was a shopman's inventory, ages, prices, counties, temperaments. Older boys fetched the highest sums. Small, quick girls were prized for kitchens. The least connected children were most desirable because no one came asking. He called it service. He said they would have died poor anyway. He said the money kept doors open for the good of God. The marshals traced his web across 3 states. 11 more children were pried from barns and sculleries, some with tongues that tried to remember Irish, some with hands that tried to forget straps. 6 remained only as handwriting. Timothy in Ohio, someone swore. Margaret in a Virginia parlor, another insisted. 2 small ones whose names Brennan had fouled on purpose. The trail, the marshal wrote later, had cooled like ash. The trial sharpened everything to points. A courtroom learned how a child sleeps on a kitchen floor and wakes with ice crusted around her mouth. How a boy can labor 18 hours in harvest and still be accused of sloth. How fists and lies can be sacraments in a false church. Brennan stood to speak before sentencing and offered a sermon about necessity, about Protestant families giving opportunity, about the survival of Catholic institutions. 12 citizens listened and then did not need long to answer. 20 years for him, less for those who helped him. Defrocking for all who had worn collars while selling children by the pound. Mother O'Malley folded in on herself and never unfolded again. She spent her remaining years in an infirmary where the sisters found her kneeling in empty air. Sister Agnes left the quiet halls she had loved and went south after the war to work among freed people, as if her hands understood only one penance, to set one child after another back in the world, even if the world didn't want them. Sacred Heart shuddered and then was sold. The seminary that tried to live inside its walls didn't last. Folks said the building kept its nighttime lights and the sound of children's feet crossing floors no longer there. In time, they pulled the bricks down and hauled them to Lancaster to help build a courthouse. The foundation took the weight. Justice, perhaps, prefers to stand on what it has learned. A small granite marker sits now where gardens once did, in a cemetery planted over memory. It says little because words cannot lift what numbers cannot bear. 14 gone between 1862 and 1865. Not adopted, not transferred, dropped from the page like crumbs brushed from a table. Sister Agnes's ledger lies in an archive drawer, each entry a thread refusing to rot. Bridget's laugh, Patrick's crooked tooth, Timothy's fear of storms. Beside his name she wrote, "God forgive us all." The scandal changed laws. Inspectors began to knock, ledgers were audited, and placements required paper as binding as vows. It did not fix people. That is slower work. Protestant neighbors shook their heads at Rome and felt justified for a century. Catholics rebuilt trust yard by yard. The rescued children tried to sleep without counting the distance to the door. Sometimes, on a summer afternoon, when thunder carries over the Susquehanna and the corn lifts its leaves to drink, you might imagine a freckled boy pausing in a field far away, touching his left palm where the scar lives, feeling the old panic rise and fade with the storm. You might picture a woman in a city kitchen who hears a bell and cannot explain why she freezes, why a certain hymn makes her set the ladle down and breathe. This was never a tale about miracles. It is a book of receipts and the hardness of human hands, and how easily virtue can be rented out by the hour when the price is right. Yet there is the other ledger, the stubborn one, where a seamstress-faced nun wrote down what could not be sold. Names, songs, terrors, hopes. That book keeps its own quiet bell ringing. It is the sound of a door unlatched somewhere, of children counted aloud, of a vow remade in plainer words, no more.